The metal screamed as the first round punched through the half-inch steel plate like paper tearing in slow motion. Oberst Heinrich Müller, commander of a Panzer Mark IV battalion outside Bastogne, had just watched his supposedly impregnable armor disintegrate under fire from a weapon he'd been told couldn't possibly penetrate German engineering. The December cold bit into his face as he crawled from the smoking wreckage, but what froze his blood wasn't the temperature. It was the realization that everything he'd been taught about American industrial weakness had been catastrophically wrong. The weapon responsible sat mounted on a half-track 500 meters away, its massive barrel still glowing faintly in the winter twilight. The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun. To Müller and his surviving crew, it wasn't just another weapon. It was proof of something far more terrifying than any tank or artillery piece could ever be. The story of how American POWs and German soldiers alike came to fear and respect this mechanical beast begins not on European battlefields, but in the sprawling factory floors of the American Midwest. While German production facilities operated under constant threat of Allied bombing, struggling with material shortages and forced labor, American manufacturers were perfecting the art of mass-producing devastation with an efficiency that bordered on the absurd. By 1943, Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company alone was producing over 700 M2 machine guns per day. The Browning Arms Company added hundreds more. Frigidog Hayes Corporation, GM Saginaw Steering Gear Division, and even the Kelsey Hayes Wheel Company had retooled their civilian production lines to manufacture components for what soldiers were already calling Ma Deuce, or simply the 50. The numbers told a story that German intelligence officers in Berlin refused to believe even when their own field reports confirmed it. By the war's end, America would manufacture nearly 2 million M2 machine guns in various configurations. Germany, by comparison, produced approximately 400,000 MG-42s, their fastest-firing weapon. But raw numbers told only part of the story. The real shock for German armor crews wasn't how many 50-caliber guns the Americans had, it was what those guns could do. Sergeant Otto Vogel of the 2nd Panzer Division recorded his first encounter with the M2 in a letter that somehow survived the chaos of the Normandy campaign. "We were told American weapons were inferior, built hastily by untrained workers. Then I saw what their machine gun did to Meyer's Panther. The turret side, 40 millimeters of face-hardened steel. The American gun was firing from perhaps 400 meters. Each round that struck punched through as if the armor was tin. Meyer never had a chance to return fire. 6 men burned because we underestimated what the Americans could build." The physics behind Vogel's nightmare was straightforward but devastating. The M2 fired a 12.7 millimeter round at roughly 2,900 feet per second. Each bullet carried over 13,000 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. For comparison, a German Kar-98K rifle round, the standard infantry weapon, delivered just 2,600 foot-pounds. The 50 caliber round carried 5 times the energy and weighed nearly 5 times as much. But energy alone didn't explain the M2's armor-penetrating capability. The Americans had developed specialized ammunition that turned the already formidable 50 caliber into an anti-armor weapon. The M2 armor-piercing round featured a hardened steel core with a ballistic cap, designed specifically to defeat the kind of steel armor German vehicles relied upon. At close range, this ammunition could penetrate over an inch of rolled homogeneous armor. At typical combat ranges of 300 to 500 meters, it still retained enough energy to crack through lighter armored vehicles and even the side armor of heavier tanks. German tank crews trained to fear anti-tank guns and enemy armor. They'd learned to identify the distinctive crack of a 76 millimeter Sherman gun or the deeper boom of a Soviet 85 millimeter. But the rapid hammering of an M2, firing up to 600 rounds per minute, created a unique psychological terror. Each burst could deliver 10 to 15 armor-piercing rounds before a tank commander could even identify the threat's location. Veterans described it as being inside a bell while someone struck it repeatedly with a sledgehammer. The noise alone was enough to disorient crews, but it was the knowledge that any second one of those rounds might find a weak spot in the armor that broke men's nerves. Lieutenant Hans Weber's testimony, recorded during his interrogation after capture near Aachen, revealed just how deeply the M2 had shaken German tactical doctrine. Our training emphasized maneuver and surprise. We were taught that American tanks were inferior in armor and firepower to our Panthers and Tigers. This was true, but our instructors never mentioned their machine guns. When we encountered American positions, we expected small arms fire we could ignore while we maneuvered into killing positions. Instead, we found ourselves under fire from weapons that could actually hurt us. Not just hurt us, kill us. The psychological impact was immense. You cannot charge a position knowing that machine gun fire, which you've been trained to dismiss, might penetrate your vehicle. The M2's effectiveness went far beyond simple armor penetration. Its versatility terrified German forces because it appeared everywhere, mounted on everything. Half-tracks, trucks, jeeps, fixed fortifications, boats, even bicycles and some desperate improvised mountings. American airborne units regularly jumped with M2s broken down into manageable components, reassembling them after landing to provide heavy fire support where German commanders expected only light arms. German after-action reports from Operation Market Garden, the failed Allied push into Holland in September 1944, repeatedly mentioned American .50 caliber positions as critical obstacles. Paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had set up M2s in church towers behind hastily constructed earthworks, even buried in rubble with only the barrel exposed. These positions could engage German armor at ranges where the armor couldn't effectively return fire without exposing themselves to other threats. Hauptmann Friedrich Koch, whose company attempted to dislodge American paratroopers from Nijmegen, wrote in his journal about the frustration of facing weapons that shouldn't have been there. Intelligence told us the American parachute infantry would be lightly armed, equipped only with small weapons until relieved. We attacked with 3 Panzer IVs in support, confident of success. The Americans had somehow brought anti-tank guns with them. At least that's what we thought. Only later did we learn these were machine guns. Machine guns! Our tanks suffered damage to vision ports, external equipment, even armor penetration from weapons we've classified as harassment fire. One vehicle lost its commander when a .50 caliber round entered through the cupola viewing slit and ricocheted inside the turret. After that, our armor refused to close within 600 meters of any American position without extensive reconnaissance. Would you have believed such reports sitting in a briefing room in Berlin, being told that American machine guns were destroying German tanks? The disconnect between what German high command wanted to believe about American industrial capability and the reality their soldiers faced created a deadly knowledge gap that cost thousands of lives. The M2's devastating effectiveness stemmed partly from American tactical doctrine that emphasized overwhelming firepower. Where German units might have 1 or 2 heavy machine guns per company, American units incorporated M2s at multiple organizational levels. An American armored division in 1944 included over 350 caliber machine guns. This saturation meant German forces couldn't simply avoid the weapon. Anywhere American forces operated, M2s would be present in numbers that made them impossible to ignore. Gefreiter Klaus Zimmermann, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, described to his interrogators the psychological warfare aspect of the weapon. You could hear them from kilometers away. That distinctive sound, slower than our MG-42, but so much heavier. Each burst sounded like someone ripping apart metal. During night attacks, you could see the tracers. Every 5th round was a tracer, burning bright red. They looked like meteors coming at you. But worse than what you saw was what you heard. The rounds made a sound when they passed nearby, a crack snap that was different from rifle fire. Deeper, more menacing. You knew if you heard that sound, the round could have killed you. It was just luck it missed. This happened over and over during an attack. The sound alone could break an advance. The M2's effectiveness in the anti-aircraft role added another dimension to German concerns. American forces mounted M2s in quad configurations, 4 guns synchronized to fire together. These Quad 50s could throw up a wall of lead that German pilots learned to respect and fear. The combined fire rate of 2,400 rounds per minute from 4 guns created what pilots described as a visible curtain of tracers. Any aircraft flying through this curtain faced near certain destruction. Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down near Antwerp in October 1944, survived to describe his encounter. We were tasked with strafing American supply columns. Intelligence indicated light anti-aircraft defense. I made my attack run at perhaps 150 meters altitude, focusing on the trucks. Then the tracers started, red lines that seemed to bend toward my aircraft. I heard impacts on my wings and felt the controls stiffen. My engine began smoking. All from what I later learned was a single Quad 50 position. One position. I counted perhaps 12 trucks in that column. By doctrine, each should have had anti-aircraft machine guns mounted. If each had fired, I would have flown through fire from 48 50-caliber barrels simultaneously. No wonder the Luftwaffe stopped trying to interdict American supplies by 1945. The industrial scale of American M2 production created its own form of psychological warfare. German soldiers couldn't destroy or disable enough M2s to make a difference because the Americans always had more, dramatically more. A German machine gun captured or destroyed represented a meaningful loss. An American M2 lost was replaced within days, sometimes hours. This asymmetry in sustainment capability meant German tactical victories often proved meaningless in strategic terms. Unteroffizier Paul Richter's account illustrated this disparity. We overran an American position near St. Vith. We found 2 M2 machine guns, both destroyed by their crews before withdrawing. We also found over 10,000 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition, neatly stored in weatherproof containers. 10,000 rounds! That much ammunition represented more than our entire battalion had for our machine guns. We realized they'd left this behind not because they needed to, but because carrying it would slow them down. They knew more guns and more ammunition would be waiting wherever they withdrew to. This abundance was more demoralizing than any speech about American industrial might could have been. The M2's reliability compounded German problems. The weapon was designed to function in extremes of temperature, dirt, and neglect. German armorer reports analyzing captured M2s repeatedly noted the weapon's robust construction and generous tolerances. These features meant the gun kept firing even when maintenance was minimal or impossible. German machine guns, particularly the MG42, were magnificent weapons, but required regular cleaning and maintenance to function properly. In the chaos of combat, this difference mattered enormously. A captured American armorer's manual for the M2 became required reading among German ordnance officers. The manual's matter-of-fact description of field maintenance procedures shocked readers accustomed to more complex weapons. The M2 could be completely field-stripped with minimal tools. Its headspace and timing could be adjusted with simple gauges carried by the crew. It could fire thousands of rounds without cleaning in emergency situations. This simplicity seemed almost crude to German engineers trained to value precision and complexity. But crude or not, it worked. Technical Sergeant Robert Mitchell, an American armorer attached to the 3rd Armored Division, was captured during the Bulge and spent time in a German POW camp before liberation. He later described conversations with German mechanics. They couldn't believe how simple the M2 was. They'd take apart our captured guns and marvel that something so straightforward could be so effective. One German sergeant told me their engineers had examined the weapon and concluded it was overbuilt. Too much metal, too heavy, tolerances too loose. Then he laughed and said their engineers were idiots. The weapon worked perfectly, despite being frozen in a Belgian winter, caked with mud, and having fired 20,000 rounds since its last proper cleaning. Their guns couldn't do that. If this revelation made you pause, you're beginning to understand what German soldiers slowly, painfully learned. The M2 wasn't superior because of advanced technology or revolutionary design. It was superior because American industry had solved a different problem than German industry addressed. Germans built precision weapons for trained soldiers supported by sophisticated logistics. Americans built robust weapons for minimally trained soldiers in chaotic conditions with assured resupply. The M2's psychological impact extended beyond its physical capabilities. German soldiers began to associate the weapon's presence with American combat effectiveness. Units known to have substantial M2 support earned a reputation for being harder to dislodge. Defensive positions with visible .50 caliber emplacements were approached more cautiously. The weapon became a symbol of American material superiority in the same way the Tiger tank symbolized German technical prowess. But there was a crucial difference. Germany built approximately 1,400 Tigers during the entire war. America built 2 million M2s. Oberleutnant Martin Schulz, a company commander in the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, recorded his thoughts on this disparity. "We received intelligence briefings about American equipment. Much time was spent on their Sherman tanks, which we considered inferior. Little attention was paid to their supporting weapons until we encountered them." I now believe this was a critical mistake. The Sherman was indeed inferior to our Panthers in direct combat, but Sherman crews could call upon supporting fire from weapons that could damage our tanks at ranges where we couldn't effectively respond. American infantry carried anti-tank rockets called bazookas. Their machine guns could penetrate light armor. Their artillery could be called down within minutes. The Sherman didn't need to be superior because it never fought alone. We learned this too late. The M2's anti-material capability meant it destroyed more than just vehicles. German commanders quickly learned that anything valuable and exposed was vulnerable. Fuel dumps, ammunition storage, command posts, artillery positions, even individual soldiers in exposed positions all proved susceptible to .50 caliber fire. The weapon's long effective range, over 1,800 meters against area targets, meant German forces had to position critical assets well behind the front lines or risk their destruction. This forced German tactical adjustments that degraded their combat effectiveness. Commanders had to disperse forces more widely. Artillery batteries had to set up further from the front. Supply dumps moved back, increasing transportation times. Command posts relocated to avoid direct fire. All these adjustments created delays and inefficiencies that compounded the Germans' growing logistical problems as the war progressed. A single weapon system forced changes in operational deployment across entire divisions. General Major Dietrich Cook, captured after the Ruhr Pocket collapsed in April 1945, discussed these adjustments during his intelligence debriefing. By late war, we assumed any American position would have multiple .50 caliber weapons with armor-piercing ammunition. Our tank commanders were instructed to engage such positions from maximum range or not at all. This doctrine ceded initiative to the Americans. We found ourselves reacting to their weapons rather than dictating the terms of engagement. For an army trained on principles of offensive maneuver warfare, this represented a fundamental failure of our doctrine to adapt to material realities. The evolution of American tactical employment of the M2 demonstrated how the weapon's capabilities expanded beyond its original design parameters. Initially conceived as a heavy infantry support weapon and anti-aircraft gun, the M2 in practice became whatever American forces needed it to be. Tank destroyer battalions used M2s to suppress anti-tank gun positions while maneuvering their main guns. Combat engineers mounted them on armored bulldozers to provide covering fire while clearing obstacles. Even tank crews, equipped with .50 calibers as secondary armament, found themselves using these weapons as primary weapons against lighter German vehicles. This versatility emerged from necessity and American tactical flexibility. German doctrine tended to assign weapons specific roles and train soldiers to employ them accordingly. American doctrine proved more fluid, trusting individual initiative and practical problem-solving over rigid adherence to manual solutions. When tank commanders discovered their 76mm guns were overkill for half-tracks, but their 30 caliber coaxial guns lacked stopping power, they simply used their turret-mounted 50 calibers. When infantry needed to suppress a building at ranges where rifle fire was ineffective, they requested M2 support. The weapon's presence in large numbers meant there was usually an M2 available to solve whatever problem arose. Private First Class Anthony Romano, an American machine gunner in the 29th Infantry Division, described this improvisational approach. "We weren't supposed to use the 50 against infantry in the open. The manual said it was wasteful, that rifles and 30s were more appropriate. But our sergeant figured if the gun was there and the bullets were plentiful, why not use them? One burst from the 50 would clear a German position that might take a platoon assault with rifles. We weren't trying to be efficient by the book. We were trying to stay alive and accomplish the mission with minimum casualties. The 50 helped us do both." German observations of American tactical methods frequently noted what they perceived as wasteful use of ammunition and firepower. American units would expend thousands of rounds suppressing positions that German units would have approached more cautiously, using terrain and maneuver. But this apparent wastefulness reflected different calculations of value. Americans valued their soldiers' lives more highly than their ammunition stocks. When faced with a choice between risking infantry in close assault or expending hundreds of 50 caliber rounds to neutralize a position, American commanders consistently chose to expend ammunition. This philosophy was possible only because of American industrial capacity. The ammunition existed to be expended. Factories back home produced 50 caliber rounds by the millions, shipped them across the Atlantic in convoys that mostly arrived intact, and distributed them to forward units through a logistics network that remained functional despite German interference. German forces, struggling with fuel shortages and transportation difficulties, couldn't afford to waste anything. They learned to hate how Americans could afford to be wasteful, because that waste reflected surplus they could never match. Oberst Wilhelm Becker, chief of staff for a panzer corps in the West, analyzed American logistics after his capture. His comments revealed the despair experienced by German officers who understood they were losing, not because of battlefield performance, but because of industrial disparity. "We calculated ammunition expenditure ratios. For every artillery round we fired, Americans fired 10. For every machine gun round, they fired 20. This wasn't because their soldiers were poorer marksmen, though some were. It was because they could afford to fire 20 rounds where we could fire 1. Their industrial capacity allowed tactical solutions we couldn't employ even if we wanted to." The M2 exemplified this. Our soldiers fired in controlled bursts to conserve ammunition. American gunners held the trigger and let the weapon pour fire until the threat was eliminated. Both approaches worked, but only one reflected sustainable logistics. The late war period saw German attempts to capture and employ American weapons when possible, including M2s. These efforts revealed just how much German tactical capability had eroded by 1944 and 1945. Reports exist of German units using captured M2s against American forces, particularly during the Battle of the Bulge when German troops overran American positions and acquired substantial equipment. But these captured weapons proved difficult for Germans to sustain. The ammunition requirements alone created problems. 50 caliber rounds were not interchangeable with any German ammunition types. German forces using captured M2s could only fire them as long as captured American ammunition lasted. Attempts to manufacture compatible ammunition in German factories proved impractical given the collapsing industrial situation. The weapons themselves required parts and maintenance that German logistics couldn't provide. American armored units would request replacement barrels for their M2s after extended firing, swapping out hot barrels for cool ones to maintain fire rates. German units couldn't requisition these parts, so captured weapons degraded over time. Lieutenant Franz Weber commanded a makeshift infantry company during the Bulge, cobbled together from various shattered units. His unit captured 2 M2s and several thousand rounds during the offensive's first days. For 3 days, those machine guns gave us firepower we hadn't possessed in months. My men could engage American positions at ranges that previously would have been impossible. But by the 4th day, one gun had stopped working, a broken part we couldn't replace. The second gun's barrel was worn smooth from firing. We had to abandon both weapons when we withdrew. For 72 hours, we felt like we were fighting on equal terms. Then, reality returned. The symbolic dimension of the M2 shouldn't be underestimated. For American soldiers, the weapon represented reliable, overwhelming firepower. Its presence was reassuring. For German soldiers, it represented everything they were losing to: American industrial strength, American material abundance, American willingness to expend resources to protect their soldiers. As the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion and German forces retreated across Europe, encounters with M2s became more frequent and more desperate. By March 1945, German units were shadows of their former strength. Panzer divisions that started the war with hundreds of tanks now fielded dozens. Supply shortages meant vehicles were abandoned for lack of fuel, even when mechanically sound. In contrast, American forces seemed to grow stronger. More men, more tanks, more of everything, including M2s.
Defensive positions in the Ruhr, in the last pockets of resistance, in Berlin itself, all faced American or Allied forces whose firepower included liberal numbers of 50 caliber machine guns. Gefreiter Hans Müller, defending a village on the approaches to the Ruhr in March 1945, described the final stages of resistance. We had perhaps 30 men, some rifles, one machine gun with limited ammunition, and a Panzerfaust with 2 rockets. The Americans attacked with tanks, infantry, and at least 4 50 caliber machine guns I could hear firing. They didn't assault our position. They surrounded it and then proceeded to destroy it piece by piece with concentrated fire. The building I was hiding in lost its roof to 50 caliber fire. The walls were being chewed apart. After 2 hours, there was nowhere left to hide. We surrendered. Fighting back seemed absurd.
We had 36 rifles against an army with infinite bullets. The M2's story is ultimately about more than a weapon. It's about the collision between 2 philosophies of warfare. Germany put its faith in superior tactics, training, and individual weapon quality. They believed these advantages would overcome numerical and industrial disparities. America put its faith in overwhelming material superiority, believing that adequate tactics, supported by superior numbers and firepower, would eventually prevail. The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun became one of the clearest demonstrations of which philosophy succeeded. German soldiers and commanders entered the war confident in their superiority. They'd been told American industry produced quantity over quality, that American soldiers were poorly trained, that American weapons were inferior. Then they encountered reality. American weapons worked reliably in conditions that disabled German equivalents. American soldiers had enough ammunition to learn through doing rather than conserving every round. American industry delivered so much equipment that losses were replaced faster than they occurred. The psychological journey from confidence to defeat was traumatic for German soldiers. The M2 featured prominently in this journey because it contradicted everything they'd been taught to believe. A machine gun shouldn't penetrate armor, but it did. An enemy shouldn't have unlimited ammunition, but they did. Industrial capacity shouldn't determine battlefield outcomes, but it did. Each encounter with the 50 caliber chipped away at German certainty until nothing remained but the knowledge that they were beaten by forces they couldn't match. After Germany's surrender, American occupation forces conducted extensive interviews with German prisoners and civilians. Many discussions touched on the M2 and its impact. A common theme emerged in these conversations. German soldiers respected the weapon even as they feared and hated it. They recognized it as a symbol of what they'd been fighting against and couldn't overcome. Some former German soldiers admitted that encountering the M2 in combat first made them doubt Germany could win the war. Others described how the weapon's ubiquity and effectiveness progressively eroded their will to resist. Perhaps the most telling assessment came from General Oberst Alfred Jodl during his post-war interrogation. As chief of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command, Jodl had access to intelligence reports from all fronts. When asked about American weapons' effectiveness, he spent considerable time discussing the M2. "We knew the specifications. We knew American forces possessed large numbers. What we failed to appreciate was how the weapon would be employed and the effect this employment would have on our tactical flexibility." The .50 caliber machine gun, more than any other single weapon, forced us to acknowledge that American industrial capacity had overcome what we considered our tactical and operational superiority. It was a lesson learned too late and at terrible cost. The M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun served American forces in every theater of World War II and continues in service today more than 90 years after its design. Its effectiveness against German armor, while significant, was only one aspect of why the weapon proved so devastating. The M2 succeeded because it was reliable, versatile, available in vast numbers, and employed by forces that could afford to use it to its full potential. For German soldiers who faced it, the weapon became inseparable from their experience of defeat. It was the sound of American firepower tearing apart their vehicles, positions, and certainties. It was proof that they'd been fighting an enemy they'd fundamentally misunderstood. And it was a reminder, delivered in 100-round bursts, that industrial capacity would overcome tactical skill when the disparity was large enough. Continue exploring how a single weapon can reshape not just battles, but the very foundations of military confidence. And if this story stayed with you, share your thoughts below so others can discover these forgotten truths about warfare's evolution.